Right now, somewhere in a forest you'll never visit, a small grasshopper is standing at the edge of a stream. It has no reason to be there. It doesn't drink from open water, it doesn't hunt there, but it walks forward anyway and drowns, compelled by something inside it that isn't entirely its own. Scientists have watched this happen hundreds of times, and every time, the question that follows is the same one that stops researchers cold. Did that animal just choose to die? Because if an animal can move toward its own destruction, what exactly are we looking at? A choice? An instinct? Or something else entirely? For most of human history, the idea that an animal might deliberately end its own life was filed away under myth, folktale, or misunderstanding. Science had a simple reason for resisting the idea. Animals are shaped by evolution to survive long enough to reproduce. Every desperate sprint from a predator, every attempt to escape a trap, every struggle for food seems to point in the same direction: live, keep living, reproduce. Self-destruction didn't fit neatly into that picture. But when researchers began documenting unusual cases systematically, the picture became harder to simplify. The evidence didn't produce a clean answer, it produced something more interesting, a question about where survival behavior ends and deliberate action begins. In 2011, Antonio Preti published a review of the scientific literature examining reports of apparent self-destructive behavior in animals. The cases ranged across species and circumstances, animals refusing food, repeatedly injuring themselves, or moving into situations that appeared dangerous without an obvious escape response. But there was a problem. A behavior can look like suicide without actually being one. Disease can change behavior. Severe stress can overwhelm an animal, parasites can manipulate a host, social behavior can favor individual sacrifice, and sometimes an animal may simply be trapped in a behavioral response it cannot control. The closer researchers looked, the harder it became to use one word to explain all of it. And then there is the grasshopper. In 2002, researchers studying the parasitic hairworm Spinocordodes documented one of nature's strangest examples of behavioral manipulation. The worm spends part of its life developing inside a grasshopper, but adulthood requires water. The parasite has a problem. The grasshopper doesn't. So the parasite changes the host's behavior. Research indicates that infection alters the grasshopper's nervous system and changes how it responds to environmental cues, increasing the likelihood that the insect moves toward water. The grasshopper approaches the stream, it enters, and the hairworm finally reaches the environment where it can reproduce. The grasshopper isn't making a calculated decision to die. Its behavior has been altered by another organism. And that distinction matters, because now the question changes. If an animal can appear to choose death while another organism is altering its behavior, how many other apparently self-destructive behaviors are actually produced by mechanisms the animal itself does not control? The hairworm isn't alone. Ophiocordyceps fungi manipulate carpenter ants in ways that are even more precise. After infection, the ant can climb vegetation and eventually clamp its mandibles onto a location that favors fungal growth. The ant dies there. Later, the fungus grows from the body and releases spores. You can actually see the result: a dead ant, frozen in place, locked onto a plant stem with a fungal structure emerging from its body. It looks like a remote control, but the mechanism is biology. Chemical signals, altered neural activity, changes in behavior, and a parasite or fungus exploiting the host's nervous system for its own reproduction. And that creates a much bigger problem for the word suicide. Because if the animal isn't consciously choosing its death, then parasites don't prove that animals commit suicide. They demonstrate something more unsettling. Behavior that looks like a decision from the outside can have a completely different cause on the inside. But parasitic manipulation only explains part of the picture. There are animals that sacrifice themselves without a parasite forcing them toward death. And this is where evolution produces another strange result. Certain ants and bees have evolved forms of self-sacrifice in which an individual can die while defending the colony. In some social insects, a behavior known as autothesis can rupture the body and release defensive chemicals, killing the individual in the process. One body is lost. The colony survives. From the perspective of the individual, that looks like self-destruction. From the perspective of evolutionary biology, however, individual survival is not the only factor that influences which traits persist. Related individuals share genes, colonies depend on cooperation, and a behavior that costs one individual its life can sometimes increase the survival or reproductive success of many others. The individual dies. The behavior continues through the surviving colony. Death becomes part of the biological strategy, not the goal, the consequence. And this is where the scientific question gets much harder, because researchers have spent more than a century debating what it even means to describe an animal's behavior as suicidal. Emma Ramsden and Duncan Wilson, in their work on the concept of the suicidal animal, examined the long history of this question and highlighted a central problem. Humans are exceptionally good at projecting intention onto other animals. An animal refuses food. We call it despair. An animal walks into danger. We call it a death wish. An animal stops responding after extreme stress. We call it surrender. But none of those observations by themselves tell us what the animal understood. And that is the line science cannot simply cross. We can observe behavior. We can measure hormones. We can examine nervous systems. We can track what happens before and after the behavior. But we cannot directly ask the animal what it intended. That matters enormously. Because human suicide involves concepts like self-awareness, intention, anticipation of death, and an understanding of the consequences of an action, we cannot assume an animal possesses those concepts simply because its behavior looks similar from the outside. And yet, that doesn't mean the animal is experiencing nothing. Some animals with complex nervous systems show prolonged behavioral changes after extreme stress. They can stop eating, withdraw from social interaction, become unusually inactive, or repeatedly place themselves in situations that appear harmful. Those observations don't prove suicidal intent, but they do make the question harder to dismiss. The real question may not be, do animals commit suicide? That question may already be too human. The better question is, what kinds of internal states can produce behavior that looks self-destructive? And once you ask that question, the animal kingdom becomes much stranger, because now the grasshopper, the infected ant, and the sacrificing bee are no longer the same story. The grasshopper is being manipulated. The ant is being manipulated. The social insect is sacrificing itself through a behavior shaped by evolution. 3 behaviors, 3 mechanisms, and from the outside, all 3 can look like the same thing: an animal moving toward death. So what about animals that are not obviously being manipulated? What about an animal with a complex nervous system experiencing extreme stress, whose behavior changes in ways that appear to offer no obvious survival advantage? This is where the evidence becomes genuinely difficult. Philosopher Daniel Peña Guzman has argued that the important question is not whether animals end their lives in exactly the human sense. It is whether some animals might possess forms of suffering or distress capable of producing behaviors that resemble self-destruction. That claim is much harder to prove, but it is also much harder to dismiss. Because the deeper researchers look into animal cognition, the more complicated the old picture of animals as simple reflex-driven organisms becomes. They learn, they remember, they solve problems, they form social bonds, they respond to changes in their environment. And in some species, their behavior changes dramatically under prolonged stress. None of that proves that an animal understands death the way a human does, but it does tell us something important. The difference between instinctive behavior and conscious experience may be more complicated than we once assumed. And perhaps that is the real mystery here. Not whether animals secretly think like humans, but how many different kinds of internal processes can produce behavior that looks intentional from the outside. Go back to that grasshopper. It's still there, at the edge of the stream, one step forward, then another, and finally the water. At the beginning of this story, it looked like the simplest possible question. Did the grasshopper choose to die? Now the question is harder, because the grasshopper probably wasn't choosing anything in the human sense. The parasite was altering its behavior. The ant wasn't contemplating death. The fungus was exploiting its nervous system, and the sacrificing insect wasn't necessarily trying to die. Its behavior had been shaped through generations of selection because defending the colony could increase the survival of related individuals. 3 different mechanisms, 1 destination, and that is what makes the word suicide so dangerous when we apply it to animals. It can make a behavior seem understood before we actually understand it. Maybe the strangest thing about animal behavior isn't that some animals move toward danger, it's how differently that behavior can arise. A parasite can manipulate a nervous system. A fungus can alter behavior. Social evolution can favor extreme forms of cooperation. Severe stress can change behavior in ways we still struggle to interpret. The same outward action can have completely different causes. And that means the question isn't simply whether an animal wants to live or wants to die. The real question is what is happening inside the animal when its behavior takes it toward danger. Is that creature choosing, or is something else driving the behavior? We still don't have a complete answer, and the closer researchers look, the more carefully they have to define the question itself.